Hello, this is Derek Taylor for HIST 103. And this is a lecture for this week's readings. And I will lecture is called The Axial Age. I want to take a look at the readings first, just to go over them real quickly. In Sources of World Societies, you'll have chapter 3, which is a series of sources on mostly religious and philosophical texts from the later period of Indian civilization down to later than what we studied before, from the Upanishads, Buddhist texts, and a few other things. And then in chapter 6 of Worlds of History, the other source reader you should have, chapter 6 is a little more comparative. It has some text from Hinduism and Buddhism. It also has text from the Hebrew Bible, from earliest text, Genesis, going later on to Exodus, Psalms, some of the prophets, and then some Christian text at the end of it. And so it's going to ask you to sort of compare these texts with that chapter in Worlds of History. The chapter is about called From Tribal Universal Religion. It kind of gets into what my lecture's about this week. And so one of the things I want to point out, I'll point out this going forward, these videos and elsewhere, is you should be asking questions about some of the sources in these source readers. This is mostly what you're going to be reading every week. First few weeks, I've given you some sources outside of these things, but you need to start asking questions about these in the discussion forum. Ask questions about a specific source. You don't have to ask not a general one about all of it, but try to get specific. Try to ask questions about, okay, what can this source tell us about so and so, or the topic you're studying. Try to relate them to what the topic of the lecture is. Try to relate them to the essays you're supposed to write as well, because that's what part of what those essays are about, is getting you to use these particular sources to make an historical argument. That's part of what the course, any introductory history course, is about. So, but what this relates to, and this is what gets us to the lecture here, is what I'm calling here the Axial Age. The emergence of world civilization 800 to 200 BC. What is the Axial Age? So let's go into this. Well, there you go. There's the question. So the Axial Age is an idea, the theory. We'll talk about in a second, the guy who came up with it, but the idea that the world went through a transitional period, in the period roughly from 800 BC to 200 BC. And this is the axis of human history, that human civilization took a great leap forward in that time frame. And then in particular, its beliefs went from, more, I guess, archaic myths to universal transcendent beliefs. I say beliefs rather than just religions, because as you're going to see, this is what's involved here isn't just, religion per se, but also philosophy. But in particular, the idea that beliefs became more sort of, I don't know how to put this, they became more transcendental. They began to aim at more than just tribal concerns, but the concerns of all of humanity or the whole cosmos. That humanity became more self-aware of its own consciousness, of its own mortality, and it sought for things, questions of, what happens after you die and stuff like this. But also about how the human personality, a human person, relates to the cosmos, to the whole world. And so the theory goes, this is all the result of stuff I've kind of been talking about last couple of weeks in my lectures: the rise and fall of empires, great, turmoil in states, revolutions, stuff I've talked about, the collapse of the Indus Valley civilization, the collapse of Minoan civilization, then Mycenaean civilization, Greece, the collapse of great Near Eastern empires after 1400 in the Near East, Egypt, Hittite Empire, Syrian Empire later on, Babylonia, the Warring States period in China, that they sort of collapse of great states and rise of smaller ones lead people to question traditional beliefs, but not necessarily to get rid of them, but to deepen them, extend them. And that these sort of whatever you want to call these transformations, they create what we think of as being some of the great world civilizations moving forward. That's one of the reasons I talk about this, because we're coming to the end of this section of the course, and we are moving into a period. The next section of the course, where you're probably familiar with more of these, these empires, right? The Roman Empire, maybe Empire of Alexander the Great. You probably know about ancient Athens a little bit. We'll talk about the first Chinese Empire, and then the Han Dynasty in China. Talk about some of the empires of India, which probably don't know as much about, but these are what I call classic civilizations. But it all comes about because of these transformations in latter part of this earlier era, and especially according to this theory. And it is a theory. It was actually devised by a Swiss psychiatrist first, and then later on a philosopher named Karl Jaspers, which dates there. He introduced this notion of the axial age in a book in 1949 called The Origin and Goal of History. And the purpose of it was pretty clearly, and as we'll see in a moment, he had a particular philosophical view. It's 1949, it's right after World War II. We just had massive, destructive World War based on nationalism and stuff like this. And so Karl Jaspers was a universalist in philosophical terms. When he talks about these changes, this theory of the axial age, he thinks all these he's thinking in terms of like progress with a capital P, that they are somehow the world's civilizations were moving toward, a greater unity and moving toward, more like a one world type of idea. And it's very much colored by these occupations when it was published. So it's coming out of that time frame, that time period. I'll come back to this in a second. The theory definitely wanting to see humanity as having one real belief system at bottom. A lot of his ideas were that all these religions, though they have big differences, they're all groping toward the same thing. That was kind of his idea. You can kind of see there's some truth to this, I think. Some, as you can see, have serious problems with it as well. You can see the chart lines up pretty well to a certain degree. You see, you have in the Middle East, you have some of the other, in the archaic period in Greece, you have China and Confucianism, more or less. You see the time frame there, rise of Confucianism, but other things, Taoism and other things as well. In India, the Vedic religions, and it gets into, we'll get to the word Hinduism in a second, but Zoroastrianism in the Middle East, we'll get to Zoroastrianism in a bit, and then Judaism. And then you've got in the Greece, of course, the rise of the polis and the age of philosophy. And by the way, philosophy, Greek philosophy, he's thinking of, Socratic philosophy, Plato, Aristotle, as a counterpart to Confucianism. I mean, as these, these universal ideas that are supposed to apply everywhere as a result of great changes in each of these civilizations. And you can kind of see where, all these basically these transformations are supposed to have taken place, places we've seen before, talked about, basically in five basic areas. All of them except for basically Zoroastrianism, occurring in areas where you have great river valleys. China is the Yellow and the Yangtze, India is the Ganges and the Indus. Israel, Palestine takes place in the Middle East, in context of Mesopotamia, and then Greece. Greece, it's the riverine systems, I guess, but these are the areas. There is there's a sort of Eurasian unity to all of this to a certain degree. And you can see here a little chart just to give you some of the cultural transformation, and then factors that sort of, this is some of the claims that some thinkers make on the basis of this. And again, one of the things, emergence of universalizing, moralizing religious philosophical traditions. I would say less notable is emergence of universal egalitarian ethic. And remember, modern world religions are produced by this. Gives a list of them, stuff I've already talked about before. Factors that have facilitated what they're calling axiality, and this is one of the things we're going to get into here. Increased sociopolitical complexity in small states, not empires. There are people who contest this assertion, as we'll get to in a moment. There's a lot of things to contest here. Increased cosmopolitanism, that's Karl Jaspers' ideas. There's, factors that says impede this over time. What eventually happens is all these transformations settle in. There'll be further transformations. within these civilizations, within these religious traditions, which is why they stop at 200 CE or so. And so it doesn't include, and that's one thing you could criticize about this, it doesn't include later transformations like Christianity, Islam. So, but that's where I'm going with this, is that I have to say there's some serious problems with this thesis in a historical sense. One is, as you can tell the way I described the theory, the criteria for it are kind of vague. You know, deepening of human consciousness, you know, search for transcendental ideas. I mean, is Confucius searching for transcendental ideas? I don't know. What's transcendental for a religion? This is a problem with that. The Chinese philosopher doesn't believe that there's anything separate from the world itself. The world is all one thing. So the criteria for this is a little bit vague. It kind of goes on with the second problem, is that there's difficulty in assigning causes for this. Yes, of course, there's definitely political upheaval going on. Yes, the rise and fall of great empires can cause these things, but not necessarily. I mean, we'll get to this in a second. It's not like ancient Israel is a great empire. It's not like the Greek city-states, which this is when Greek philosophy is going to emerge. It's like those are great empires. So again, you're getting a difficulty in assigning causes. I mentioned thirdly, already, like failure to account for later transformations, or treating later transformations as if they are not as important, which, given the significance of, again, those two mostly, Christianity and Islam, that's debatable, right? The other major problem with this is, in fact, Jasper's, and that should be apostrophe after the S, not before it. Your teacher has no grammatical skills. No, I'm kidding. No, his universalism is a big problem. The idea that, because he really does think, he wants to say they're all basically the same, all these civilizations, all these religions. That's not obvious. And again, you understand why, because the world's so full of conflict over nations and religions and stuff like this. But, about 10 years ago, there was a book published by a gentleman who's a professor of religion up at, I think it's Boston University, named Stephen Prothero, called God is Not One. I never read the book, but the whole purpose of the book was to dispel this notion that all the religions of the world are exactly the same. And that's not what Jasper is saying. I'm dumbing down his idea. I'm trying to shorten it for you. But his theory has to ignore the differences. And it's true. Look, it's true. There's a lot. You're going to see a lot of similarities of what I'm about to follow in this lecture. There's interesting parallels here, maybe even connections. But there are also serious differences you should not downplay. And in fact, if you ask a serious believer of one of these religions and tell them, your religion, you're a Buddhist, for example, your religion is basically the same as like Islam, I think they might be upset if you said that. I think they have a right to. I don't think you have a right to go doing that. I know Jasper seems like a really good man, but I think that's a big problem with his theory. Nonetheless, as a sort of framing device, I think it's useful for thinking about how the world is changing historically in this period. So we're going to run with it and talk about some of these transformations here. In particular, we'll start with India. And left off last time talking about religion in India, and I hinted at this. And what happens is that Vedic religion begins to change. And they'll change into several different traditions which are related, and which we'll talk about here. And we'll get the chronology. We'll hear the Upanishads, text I've already mentioned, I'll come back to. Then Mahavira, the so-called Vardhamana, the founder of the religion of Jainism. And then finally, that of Siddhartha Gautama, I should say, the Buddha, founder of Buddhism. So let's get into this. Okay, so there's an evolution going on. I mentioned when I talked about ancient India that Vedic religion was really centered on sacrifice and ritual and doing all these sacrifices. And what's going to happen in these later texts, and even the latest Vedic texts themselves, is that you're going to get a reaction against this emphasis on sacrifice and ritual. You're going to get, if you recall, by the end of the Vedic period, there's a very dominant Brahmin priestly caste. And so you're going to get this, reaction against the excessive accumulation of worldly wealth and power. And eventually you're going to get in the Upanishads, especially, hope for an afterlife, hope for an afterlife in paradise, which doesn't focus on those things as well. What happens, generally speaking, is that you're going to get, really what happens is sacrifice almost gets turned into an abstract principle. There are basically two main components of reality in this. That one's the Atman, the individual self, and then the Brahman, which becomes the ultimate principle of reality. And so you have this abstraction of this early sense of the world as being, created by sacrifice, sustained by it, to being then again being something that's actually this principle that you have to achieve, through which you have to get rid of things like desires and get rid of your desire for the body. So the physical world becomes an impermanent thing, which is not as important. And so you have this trend away from sacrifice and this trend toward more philosophical rather than sacrificial types of religious thinking. And again, there's a couple of big emphases in the Upanishads. And one is they emphasize the growth of knowledge or religious knowledge over ritual. And this has also led to, for example, a quest for ultimate truth. One of these, a prayer from one of these early Upanishads says, quote, "From the unreal, lead me to the real. From death, lead me to immortality," unquote. And so you're pointing toward, again, knowledge as the ultimate source of salvation. I don't put those terms as the goal of, achieving an afterlife. And so, and so you're going from, the Vedic idea of you live an upright life by performing your duties and doing sacrifices in this life, to now it's being, you're finding an expression of of immortality as being an escape from the mundane world. And so these two emphases are going to really dominate Indian civilization really ever after in some regards. And so you have this idea where you have this culmination of this ideal, and that you're going to have this so you have this separation between normal existence, which is of the body, and then the permanent things that are of this more abstract essence, abstract absolute, where the Brahman is the eternal unchanging principle, and the Atman is the self. And so getting rid of self is the basis of this. And so what you have in the Upanishads is a sense of life as a ceaseless cycle of never-ending alteration between life and death. And this will become the key basic understanding of key thought in religious law, Indian religious thought in life. This endless cycle of existence they call samsara. And so basically what you have is a ceaseless cycle of death and rebirth going over and over and over again. And this is the normal lot of people in this world. And so the goal of later Indian thought, this is the problem that all later Indian thought has to deal with, is how do you get out of this? And one of the things that's one of the other key ideas they have that will be part of their solutions to the problem is karma, which means either work or action. And the idea is that basically every action has a reaction, has inevitable effects, good and bad. Good deeds bring good results, bad ones being bad ones. And and again, action is necessary. The Bhagavad Gita urges action in the world. So there is and I mention this because they're going to have two approaches to how you approach these things: an ordinary norm, what's called an ordinary norm, and an extraordinary one. And the ordinary one is called dharma, and means something like duty or moral law or right order. It's kind of similar to the Tao in Chinese thinking. It encompasses the cosmic order and the individual, so it is kind of like that in a way. And the hope for this is that if you live an upright life, if you take action in the world of samsara as is necessary, if you accept the responsibilities of your status, your sex, your social class, your caste, all these other sorts of things, then you can, you can do those things that require merit for your Atman and avoid those things that that lead to evil consequences. And so rebirth in paradise is the highest attainable goal. And but all achievement in the world of Dharma is unfortunately ultimately impermanent and subject to change. So that's the sort of lesser ordinary norm. The second, more radical solution, this is one of the big changes within Indian religion, is what's called moksha, extraordinary norm. And this means literally abandoning the world, means something like liberation or abandoning the world to escape from existence, escape all the effects of karma by escaping action itself. You withdraw from normal life. The person has to seek, has to withdraw from normal life, and withdraw from the responsibilities of family and society. And this involves becoming a sort of, hermit or a wanderer, a wandering sage type, a yogi, which is sometimes called a sannyasi or a renouncer. This is where we get the idea of religions of renunciation. You renounce the world. And again, you first get these ideas, elaborated in the Upanishads, and it demands serious self-sacrifice, though. And they will demand what's called asceticism, self-denial, self-renunciation, and so you're going to have all these things. And the goal here is the liberation from all rebirth. And if you do this, you will be liberated, permanent liberation from all birth, rebirth, and death. And so you're going to see this. One of the things about this, by the way, historically speaking, is that a lot of the people who embrace these ideals in this period, after close to 500, 400 BC, they were not from the Brahmin priestly caste. They were from the warrior noble class, the Kshatriya in India. And so they came from a different class of people. And it's almost a sort of militaristic form of renunciation they enact to try to do these things. Now, what happens is that, and again, you're going to have this feed into what's going to become later on the Hindu, we call it the Hindu tradition, the sort of mainstream of Indian religious life today. It also, this movement toward greater asceticism will spawn two other faiths. One is called Jainism, and they are a community that traces its founding to a man named Vardhamana. Excuse me, I screwed that up. Vardhamana, whom they call Mahavira, or the great hero, because he is believed to have been he's sort of the final victor over samsara. He's the victor over the endless cycle of death and birth. And they see him as, by the way, not as a god, he's a human being, but he's the sort of, first great teacher who is able to do this and extricate his soul from the material world and its karmic repercussions. And so there's no end to sort of this phenomenal existence. All souls persist in his teaching in a ceaseless cycle of generation into generation. And so, and so you have this idea that, you're going to have to escape from this somehow. And his solution to this was to focus on eliminating evil thoughts and acts. His very radical ascetic practices aimed at destroying defilements of the flesh, basically, and all actions that would lead to further karmic, destruction. And so he began practicing this at the age of 30, eventually giving up even clothing. That's how radical it was. After 12 years of this, he attained what they thought to be enlightenment. And so he went around for 30 years teaching this to other people. And at the age of 72, he actually chose to fast to death, to burn out the last essences of bad karma in his body, while at the same time seeking what they call ahimsa, or non-injury, not to injure other people. So it's a very, again, extreme sort of asceticism the Jains have. Most Jain, there are in Jainism, however, they're also most Jains are not monks. They have a monastic order that does the sort of extraordinary way. That's more like Mahavira and his extreme asceticism. They take vows not to kill, not to steal, not to lie, not to engage in sex or anything like that, or to own anything, I should say. Similar to monasticism and other traditions, there are other mostly laymen. There are about 3 or 4 million Jains in Western India today. So, and you have them, this dichotomy, as you'll see, and the other major religion that emerged in that period. This is, by the way, a set of Jain pilgrims attending a ceremony in India. Okay, the other one, of course, you're probably more familiar with is Buddhism, which is traced to one man, traditionally Siddhartha Gautama, and you have the dates for his life there. And it's probably the greatest export that Indian civilization has given to the rest of the world in some regard. He was a contemporary of Mahavira. He was born in fairly comfortable circumstances, oftentimes described as a nobleman or a prince or something like this. But at the age of 29, again, similar age to Mahavira, age 30, he began to be concerned about the lot of human suffering, aging, sickness, death, abandons his home, abandons his family to go try to answer the question of how you get out of this endless cycle of existence. He studies with teachers, renowned teachers, and then takes up extreme ascetic disciplines, penance, and self-mortification, turns finally to yogic meditation, I should say. And under a Bodhi tree, he finds enlightenment. And he goes into a trance, and he sees all of his past lives and sees how to stop all the endless suffering that comes from all this. And he pledged himself to achieving this for other people. And so he goes around teaching this. And the cardinal virtue of Buddhism is compassion for all beings. The goal being nirvana, again, similar to Jainism and these other ones, release from these karmic restraints, release from the endless cycle of action and reaction in people's lives. And this, by the way, is a depiction of, I think, from the 2nd century BC. Don't know. This is a depiction of Siddhartha Gautama as an ascetic. Again, as someone who's been fasting, you can literally see his ribs, obviously. So when we say asceticism, we mean something very extreme. We're talking about these ancient figures, these ancient sages. And he devoted to teaching what he called the Four Noble Truths. This is the basis of the Buddhist faith today. The first is that all life is dukkha, or suffering. There should be another quotation mark there. The second is that the source of suffering, all suffering, is desire. The cessation of desiring is the way to end suffering. If you get rid of desire, you can stop suffering. And that the path to end this is eightfold. What is the eightfold path? Like this: right understanding, right thought, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right contemplation or concentration. I've heard it different ways, but those are the fourfold, path things you have to do apparently in order to discipline oneself as a Buddhist. And so this will become the sort of standard for these people going through all of this. And so you have this transformation in which you have this great shift from sacrifice as the center of ritual and moral duty to a sort of tradition where you have withdrawal and renunciation. And so you have in Jainist and Buddhist tradition, laymen and women, so the extraordinary and the ordinary norm is there. And in later Hindu tradition will draw on all these traditions, which again, as you'll see, we'll get to that in the next lecture on India. It has to do with changes in political life, but it is definite trend here, which is interesting and has some parallels elsewhere. So that's the Indian transformation. Now we're going to compare the two great philosophical traditions that emerged in the same period. And that would be the revolutions in philosophy in China and Greece. Now, I have talked about already China. This is Confucius, Mencius, Lao Tzu, and the unification of the Chinese. I'm going to repeat a lot of it here, but I'll repeat a couple of obvious points. One is that Confucius is writing his teaching during the disintegration of the old Jew society during the Warring States period. So this is one common factor here. As you're going to see in a moment, Greek philosophy is going to emerge several hundred years after the collapse of Mycenaean civilization. So there's a little time left, but okay, similar there. It's also similar to the Greek transformation that there's a lot of different ideas floating around. As I mentioned, the lecture on early Chinese civilization, the so-called 100 schools comes about because there are so many different ideas floating around. As you're going to see, there's a ton of different ideas floating around ancient Greece, even before Socrates and Plato and Aristotle appeal on the scene. However, one of the things that's different about this is that Chinese thought's much more socio-political and practical. Every single Chinese thinker is going to recommend a type of political philosophy, even Taoism at one point. Whereas you see with the Greeks, they have a much different idea of this. Not everybody's a political thinker. Some people are explicitly not, actually. There's a little more, I would say, you could say scientific spirit. We'll get to this in a moment in ancient Greek thinking. A couple other things about Confucian tradition as well, and this will contrast to a certain degree. Let me contrast or compare with the Greek tradition, is that the Confucian tradition stressed ancient wisdom. So, it's not like we talked about this in the earlier lecture. Confucius is looking back to, the ancient sage kings of the Shang dynasty and the Zhou dynasty as being, great models. So you wonder, well, okay, why is this a transformation? What I also mentioned was he stresses it, though, in a meritocratic way, in a way that ordinary people can now partake of this. They can make themselves into gentlemen. They can harmonize themselves with the universe and become successful. The other thing to note here is that philosophy in ancient Greece is going to cut against the grain of religion to a certain degree, whereas China, again, I mentioned this on the last lecture, China doesn't have that kind of separation. It's not like Confucius doesn't talk about religion that much in the Analects. Other Confucian thinkers do, but for the most part, these things aren't separate categories to them. And remember, they have that sort of, again, almost Indian, similarity with Indian thought, where the harmony of the universe, the order of the state, and the order of the self are all kind of one thing. In other words, China is kind of has a monistic understanding of the universe rather than a dualist one, which is kind of something different here, as you're going to see, which can be kind of very different to a certain degree in ancient Greece. And Greek philosophy is interesting because in some ways there are similarities with the Greeks and the ancient Mesopotamians. In fact, if you go back to the earliest creation account in Greek culture, which is the work called Theogony Hesiod, who's not a scientist, not a religious thinker, but a poet. His account of the universe sounds a lot like creation accounts from Babylon and from ancient Mesopotamia. It's a possibility that those stories migrated west or something like this. So there's some parallel there. The biggest difference with all of these so far is that really, if you're going to think about anything like modern science, you probably shouldn't. But if it has an antecedent in the ancient world, it's probably an ancient Greek philosophy. It tends to cut against the grain of tradition a little more firmly than do some of these other belief systems we'll talk about here. On the other hand, however, ancient Greece does experience a political crisis, sort of like China does. Here you can see this is what the Greek world looks like in the 6th century. This is what we're talking about. And in fact, as you're going to see here, which is interesting about Greek philosophy, it does not begin in mainland Greece. It begins in Ionia on the coast, as you're going to see, of Western Turkey, Asia Minor. So again, maybe, sort of ideas move. There's some thought that these ideas have moved from, the east to the west. When these Greek ideas will come to. And the thinkers who are usually credited with being the first philosophers, although that's kind of it's kind of an anachronism because they really weren't philosophers in a modern sense at all. There are people that Aristotle, a later thinker, called physiologoi, inquirers into nature. They raised questions about nature. They speculated about the nature of the natural world. And they tended to, as you'll see in a moment, posit unitary naturalistic explanations for why the world worked the way it did. And when I say explanations, one thing you have to understand about these, well, two things you have to understand. One is that most of these seem to have no reference to supernatural powers. That's pretty rare for the ancient world, if not totally unique. The second thing is we don't really know exactly what these people believed. And the reason why is most of their works have not survived except in fragments. When they have, this is one of the things about them, these teachers, and they were teachers when they were doing this, a lot of them wrote down their thinking in verse. Yeah, these aren't really necessarily philosophers in a modern sense. Most of the evidence we have about them comes from later thinkers, again, like Aristotle, who didn't like them very much. They were biased against them. So we have to be careful what we say about this stuff, but it seems they did posit in general these things about the natural world. And to give you some examples of the things they posited, I'll go through several of these. They're all kind of weird. Thales, for example, seems to be the oldest of these. Again, gave rational natural explanations for phenomena, but he also had this idea that water was the primary substance by which the world was made. Everything is water. Weird, right? Again, kind of odd ideas. Anaximander, another one of these pre-Socratic thinkers. The idea that the basic element is unlimited, and that shockingly, humans originated in water and evolved. And you'll get ideas like this, by the way. Human beings changed and evolved among the pre-Socratics, and even some Indian thinkers in the same time period. Maybe the most famous of these pre-Socratics is a guy named Heraclitus from the 6th century BC, who, again, his thing is everything is always in flux. That idea of the flux, everything is in motion. And yet the logos is the guiding principle of this. And logos has, that term is so loaded, I won't go into it here, but you get the idea. The guiding principle is some sort of reason or rationality. That's something that some of these thinkers have, that reason organizes the world this way. Again, this idea of all things being in motion feeds into something called atomism, which is also to these pre-Socratic thinkers, Leucippus and Democritus. The entire world consists of tiny solid particles, atoms, where you get the term from, and the world itself is a sort of like a machine that operates. Again, this is why it operates without reference to the gods, because it keeps banging into each other. And so you have these ideas that set things in motion this way. And Anaxagoras, who's actually, I believe, was a friend and colleague of the Athenian statesman Pericles. This is late here we're talking about. Again, distinction between matter and mind. Again, you're getting this distinction between the physical and the intellectual world in these thinkers. So you have this growth of these ideas about the natural world, man's place in it, among the so-called pre-Socratics. And if you don't know why they're called pre-Socratics, by the way, of course, it's they precede the teaching of Socrates and then his students. Things are going to take a turn, however, by the 5th century. Of course, what's going to happen in the 5th century in Greece is that you're going to have the rise of city-states. You're also going to have the rise of self-government, democracy, and in general, territorial government, which we'll read about in a couple of weeks. But in 5th century Athens, in the 400s, you have people who are humanists, who are called sophists. Sophia just means wisdom or knowledge. And there are people who go around teaching people for a fee, who claim to teach reason and virtue, but more in particular, they claim to be able to teach rhetoric. And one of the reasons they did this is because people, and I'll get this when I get to this next time, talk about the Greek city-state. The Greek city-state, law courts were essential. Rhetoric was essential for the Greek city-state in these self-governed city-states. Why? Because if you're a citizen, you need to be able to win arguments in law courts, win arguments in the assembly. So you need to be able to speak well. And so the sophists agreed to teach people how to win arguments for a fee. And they, used, reason to sort of analyze human beliefs and institutions. Now, we have to be careful about this because, again, we mostly have knowledge of later thinkers to talk about these sophists. But according to Plato and some of his generation, what made these people were objectionable because they were moral relativists. Why? Because they were teaching people how to analyze human beliefs and institutions and win arguments in a particular city. Then they go to another city and teach a different set of arguments to win a different set of win in a different set of assemblies, different set of law courts. In other words, they taught as if these things just change from place to place, as if reason and virtue were not universal. This is part of what Plato and Aristotle will be reacting against. I'll talk about them when I get to Greece next time. So they're part and parcel. This represents a big turn, and it's almost assuredly associated with the rise of the city-state and the crisis of the city-state polis. Especially, and it's embodied in Socrates, because you seemingly have a search for universal answers to ethical, political, and religious questions. And of course, everyone back then sees moral principles as governing the state, or wants to anyway. And that will feed into what we believe as we see as the dominant, philosophical tradition of ancient Greece, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Although there is some thought that Socrates himself, he was accused of being a sophist. The reason being that if you read at least what scholars think are the earliest dialogues of Plato, because we don't have Socrates. Socrates didn't write anything down. Again, Socrates is like some of these older sages, like Confucius, who didn't write anything down. But Plato's earliest dialogues seem to have him raising questions and doubts about things like the justice of the gods or the justice of Athenian tradition without giving any answers for it. And so this seems to be kind of disturbing. And again, you'll get the philosophical tradition we're most familiar with, I think, as a reaction to, if not Socrates, but that general broad humanist questioning of things, which is, again, unique, it seems, to the Greek civilization in this period. And so you have a kind of a different set of responses, really, with the Chinese philosophical turn and the Greek one. The Greeks become more scientific, maybe a little more skeptical, whereas the Chinese seem to reaffirm the ancient traditions, even while making them a little more available to everybody. It's very interesting that it goes that way. And so finally, we have the last of these great transformations, which is the emergence of monotheism in this period. And this is kind of an interesting one to talk about. And just a couple of things to note here. One is that there have been theories about this. And if you've never heard the term, maybe you've never heard the term before, I mentioned this last time, I think, when I talked about first civilizations in ancient Israel, is that most scholars think ancient Israelites were originally what was called henotheistic, or at least not all scholars, but a lot of scholars anyway. This idea was actually concocted by a scholar of religion in the 19th century named Max Muller. A lot of Germans involved in all these ideas, and it's interesting because Max Muller was actually a scholar of the Rig Veda, of Vedic texts, and some people criticized him because maybe thought his ideas were too influenced by that, but it comes from this idea, and there's a theory that monotheism arose gradually out of this, and you'll get this gradual but sort of unique unfolding in ancient Judaism. I guess the most classic view of this is of Max Weber in his book Ancient Judaism. I guess a book or an article, Ancient Judaism, in 1919, in which he stressed the uniqueness of ancient Jewish thought, because it did, as you see in a moment, separate human action from the forces of nature and the forces of history so much, and that it fed into modern ways of thinking that way. On the other hand, you also have a theory that's gained some currency in the last 30 or 40 years or so, which is that of revolutionary monotheism. It's associated, ironically, with an Egyptologist, a guy named Jan Assam, whose basic idea is that there wasn't a development, but a sort of revolution, that the Mosaic covenant represented a sort of rejection in ancient Israel of the sort of pagan culture surrounding him. I don't know that any of these theories, by the way, have gained universal acceptance, but this is something that's posited in its favor this way. I won't belabor you with too many details, but something to think about. One other thing to note as well is, and that's Jan Assam is interesting, was also a scholar of the Egyptian pharaoh Akhenaten. I mentioned that because there are sometimes, I don't think people actually buy this as much anymore, scholars do, if I'm not mistaken, but there were some candidates for the emergence of monotheism before ancient Israel. The one most cited seems to be Zoroastrianism. And I'm going to throw it in here because usually it's taken to be founded by a guy named Zarathustra, sometime before 1000 BC, in which seems to be this, I think most people agree, this is a sort of henotheistic worship of Ahura Mazda, the main sort of god in that pantheon. Usually it's seen as being a sort of precursor in some ways to develop Israelite monotheism, Christianity later on. We have texts that go back. They don't go back that far, though. However, the earliest texts that actually talk about Zoroaster or Zarathustra are called the Avesta and the Young. Is it actually two sets of texts, the Old Avesta and the Young Avesta? And they don't go back to like the second millennium AD. And so we don't actually know. We don't have a lot of historical evidence there was a Zarathustra, is my point. We have texts that are more or less roughly contemporary, a few hundred years after. Nobody mentions Zarathustra from Greece and other places like that. And in any event, we do know that it's not really sort of, I don't know how people confuse this, to be honest with you, with monotheism. Zoroastrianism has a sort of double dualism to it, in the sense that on the one hand, there is both a distinction between what's called the world of thought and the world of bones in some of these older texts, which means the world of matter and the world of thought or spirit. And then two principles, one, good versus evil. Dualism in a moral sense means that good and evil are fighting it out. Now, there are some, as you'll see, there are some phrases in some of these texts which seem to indicate things like something like a final, like apocalyptic judgment. Like there's a scheme in Zoroastrian thinking that Zoroaster was the first of these sort of sages that would appear over a 12,000 year period. And that one would appear every 3,000 years, and the world would end, but 12,000 years, something like this. Again, it's hard to tell when these ideas came about, when they were written down. And in fact, until the middle of the 20th century, Western scholars didn't actually have a great grasp on the language of some of these older texts. So, but there has been claims that this influenced Jewish and Christian and Muslim ideas in that regard. So take it for what it's worth. It was eventually wiped out, was Zoroastrianism, even though it was the official religion of Persian Empire well into the 6th century AD. It's done away with by Islam, coming of Islam. Still exists today. There are still Zoroastrian believers called the Parsis in Western India today, who, as far as I can tell, are functionally monotheistic today, but where they really were back 1000 BC, it's kind of hard to tell. So we're left with, essentially, and my point is, the Horiol traditional story. And this, by the way, is one of the rituals of modern, it's from modern Western India, of the Zoroastrian faith, which has to do with fire, as you can tell. This leaves us with the Hebrew prophets, basically, because usually the story goes is that, until the Hebrew prophets came along, ancient Israel wasn't thoroughly monotheistic. Now, I think it's debatable. I think you can go back to the Mosaic covenant. I think you can do that. I understand when some people are skeptical, but whatever the case may be, and the theory goes here, is that this is tied to the division of the state of Israel in the 920s. Remember, it's divided, gets conquered. So again, you have some of that same, if you take the Axial Age seriously, there's all these, conquest by greater powers. The kingdom of Judah gets sent off into exile for whatever, 50 years or whatever it is. And so around about the same time, you have the Hebrew prophets emerge. And they begin, if you've read anything of like Isaiah or Jeremiah, they condemn Israel for its sins. They condemn it for its departure from the law. And yet they still emphasize the role of Israel as a people in the plan of God for now, and this is the key thing, all of human history. And as in their telling, and again, you don't have to take this, take it whatever you like, but firmly that the God of Israel seems to be the God of all humanity, that in the destruction of the kingdom of Israel, the prophets sort of reinterpret things, whereas, it's not now a matter of one people's kingdom, but a matter of God's plan for all of humanity. And Israel can actually contribute to that in this way. This is really important. This is the contribution, if you want to say a change is happening in ancient Israel. And again, you can take this whatever you want, but the idea, the much more clearly expressed idea of a transcendent God. What I mean by transcendent has nothing to do with nature. He's separate from human nature. He's separate from natural world, separate from history. The God of the Hebrew prophet stands above time and history and controls it all. He also embodies and wants human beings to embody an ideal of justice and goodness and demands it from the people of Israel. When they don't, he punishes them. And one of the things, again, I pointed out because it's kind of similar, you see running through this, not necessarily in China, though, is a de-emphasis on sacrifice, right? This gets into the first books of the prophet Isaiah. Your sacrifices are offensive to me because you're doing bad things, right? Emphasizing transcendent morality. But the other thing is this, the other major thing, this is what Max Weber was pointing out. I didn't explain it that well earlier, but this is the significance of humanity in history. The idea that Israel's troubles are not random, they are a punishment from God, which again, in the collapse of the Israelite kingdom must have seemed like, we're dead. What this means is, in the Hebrew, I'm extrapolating from the Hebrew prophets, what they're saying is that because you failed to live up to this, God is merciful. If you turn back, you can have some effect on world history. The world, both historical, natural, is not, it's not independent of human action. It's amenable to human action. And this is something that's really crucial, at least in Max Weber's telling him, that it means, of course, human beings can have an effect on the world. They're not, fated, again, to be destroyed, things like this. It depends on their sort of moral actions. And so that effectively is, what we think being the emergence of monotheism is what the axial age amounts to. Again, how much that you should take literally. Use it as it's sometimes, I said, a framing device. If you know what a heuristic device is, a heuristic device is sort of like it's an idea you use just to sort of interpret things. Use it as an interpretive framework. Don't take it too literally, but read the readings about, the transformation of Indian religion, of, you talk about the readings from China too. You can bring those in there, but not for this week. But talk about this stuff and for, the development of ancient Hebrew religion, and discussing and what changes cause these changes. What kind of things are going on? Is there any links between these different changes in religious thinking? Because so many of them, of course, are still operative today in the world. So that is it. That is the lecture for this week. You should also have coming up pretty soon an essay and an exam. So get ready for that as well. So thank you guys for listening. Take care and have a great week. See you next time.